Case Western Reserve University's Great Thinkers series proudly presents the Origins Science Scholars Program. These lectures are presented by the Institute for the Science of Origins, a partnership of Case Western Reserve University and the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, with the generous support of Richard Morrison and the assistance of Case Western Reserve University's College of Arts and Sciences, Media Vision, and WVIZ PBS and 90.3 WCPN IdeaStream. Welcome to the Origins Science Scholars Program, a series of talks on current research topics in origins sciences. Hello, my name is Glenn Starkman, Director of the Institute for the Science of Origins, and I'm pleased to serve as your host for this series. The talk you're about to watch is entitled Critterworld, How Biology Transformed One Planet's History. As you will soon learn, the Earth, its atmosphere, oceans, and even rocks are the way they are because they have been shaped by the presence of plant and animal life. In this talk, Ralph Harvey, Associate Professor of Geological Sciences at Case Western Reserve University and a Fellow of the Institute for the Science of Origins, will tell you about how life shaped our planet. And now, enjoy the talk.
Okay, I'll dive right in. First, a couple of confessions, or disclaimers, if you will. I'm not an expert on this stuff, okay? And at some level, that makes me uncomfortable to talk about it. None of the data I'm going to show you here is data I collected as a scientist or manipulated in some way. That said, by profession, I'm a planetary geologist. And that means I spend a lot of my time trying to tie together observations from chemistry, from biology, from physics, using math to model things, trying to understand history in almost a narrative sense as I try and read what I see in the planet. So what I am in a lot of ways as a planetary geologist is a generalist. I'm somebody who tries to tie things together and come up with theories that explain the bulk of what people are seeing. Okay? The best analogy I can give you to kind of understand the planetary geologist approach is that planetary geologists are to normal geologists kind of the way veterinarians are to MDs. You know, you'd go to an MD if you want somebody who knows every millimeter of the human knee. You wouldn't go to the veterinarian. On the other hand, the veterinarian can look at a giraffe's knee, can look at a mouse's knee, and can look at a bumblebee's knee and see how they're the same and see how they're different and postulate why those differences might exist, okay? So that's the kind of scientist I am, at least for tonight, as we go over this issue of how biology has affected the planet Earth and, by corollary, how the other planets of our solar system have not been affected. We're going to talk about this in three parts, matching the commercial break structure. I'm not sure my breaks are going to fit well with the time frame, but we'll do our best. We're going to talk about Earth's history, and particularly how it has changed over time. And we're going to focus on a couple of specific things. We're going to focus on tectonics, that is the movement of the crust of the Earth, okay, and how that results in continents, which we're all kind of familiar with. We've got continents and oceans. Then we're going to look at Venus and Mars briefly and talk about how they are different. And then finally, I'll try and show and emphasize for you why biology is perhaps the most important of these differences. So let's go right in. Short history of the Earth. We know the solar system is about 4.6 billion years old. If you want me to be more accurate, I'll say 4.577 plus or minus 30 million years old. Within a few million years, the disk of gas and dust that is coming together to form the sun is also forming planets out of just the loose leftover bricks and mortar of this process. It's pretty clear from many studies that this process is really something that happens over sort of the few million to 10 million year time frame, which is really fast for geologists used to thinking in longer terms. as these objects come together and grow, the amount of gravitational control they have over their environment also grows. The raw material they're being made of includes light and fluffy materials like balls of ice, water ice, CO2 ice, methane, ammonia, as well as more robust things like iron nickel metal and iron nickel sulfides and silicate minerals, a whole zoo of different solid materials. All that's coming together. It's basically being heated as these collisions occur at many tens of kilometers a second. As this body is behaving kind of plastically with a lot of externally arriving heat arriving in the form of planetesimals, it starts to differentiate. And what I mean by that is the more dense, heavy materials like iron, nickel, metal tend to settle to the gravitational center, the core of this forming planet, if you will, and the lighter material tends to try and migrate out toward the top. That would be the crust and the atmosphere and the hydrosphere. And in between is a thick layer that we call the mantle. And we're going to talk a little bit about that mantle and crust in more detail as we try and talk about the history of the crust of the Earth. Now, one thing happens to the Earth that's rather unpleasant and distinguishes it right away from the other planets. The Earth has a moon which is really, really big compared to the moons of other planets in terms of relative size. And there's been a lot of puzzling over this for hundreds of years. And over the last about 25, 30 years, a fairly consistent theory has come forth that a proto-Earth, maybe about 4 times as big as the Earth we are on now, was hit by a Mars-sized body. It was a nasty, glancing blow. Basically, both planets came apart. And what formed in the end was the core of the old proto-Earth as kind of the main body, and then a disk of completely vaporized and then recondensed stuff that would later come together gravitationally to be the moon. Okay? This happened sometime, again, in that first sort of 10 million years, a long, long time ago. But what you can see is that that is an event that would kind of overwrite whatever original composition the proto-Earth would have had, particularly in terms of the kinds of materials we call volatiles, things like water, CO2, methane, things that prefer to be gases. You heat them up and they just fly away. That stuff, a lot of it gets wiped off the face of the Earth. Luckily, a lot of that material is still outgassing from the interior of the planet, so we start to develop an atmosphere, okay? Some of it's coming from the interior of the Earth, particularly a lot of the CO2, but some of it is in the continued delivery of volatile-rich objects, meteorites, comets, etc. We're still far enough back, early enough in the history of the solar system that it's a pinball machine, and objects are flying around and still accreting. Accretion isn't quite done, it's just slowing down. As this accretion does slow down, less and less of that material is developed, and the Earth as a whole starts to cool. Now, there have been a lot of pictures. You know, I'm sure you want a mental picture of what the Earth was like at that time, and I'm happy to deliver. This is a Chesley Bonestell picture from the 50s, a beautiful, beautiful picture that geologists still use. It's got a nice, hot, glowing moon there. We've got sort of an intuitive sense of rock that was molten, and floating on it are kind of rockbergs of crusty, let's just call it scum, you know, the cooled, congealed rock on the surface, and they're moving around, floating around. There's some problems with this, but let's ignore that. And the truth is, this is a good intuitive picture for this stage in the Earth. And we know from modern examples, if you have a pool of very, very hot, rocky material, the surface is going to try and cool. It's trying to follow the second law of thermodynamics, radiate away its heat and, you know, distribute it through the universe. And this is a picture from a volcano in Africa where we see a lava lake, basically, up in the caldera of the volcano. And you can see the congealed plates are moving around as the more liquid plastic material underneath is convecting. And these plates interact. Some plates will jam under other plates. Some plates will just simply pile against each other and kind of glue themselves together. And again, this is not a bad analogy, not correct in the details, but not bad in a general sense of what the Earth's crust does as a whole. Now, our understanding of this as geologists has been a fundamental, basic concept that we call plate tectonics. And plate tectonics has become, over the last about 50 years, a paradigm for geologists that help us understand the global history of the Earth, the interaction of these stiff crustal plates as they move around horizontally across the surface of the Earth. Turns out to have a dramatic effect not only on how mountains are built, but how sediments move, how volcanoes form, what kind of material they form, etc. The basics of this paradigm are that the Earth appears to have about a dozen crustal plates. They're shifting around on the Earth. Some of them are continental, and those are the high areas you can see in this image. This is basically just topography, so the brighter colored areas are higher, okay? In the ocean bottoms, what we have is lower material. Those are called oceanic plates, and in some places, the oceanic and the crustal plates are kind of welded together kind of nicely. In other places, the oceanic crust and the continental crust are interacting in different ways. Now, as these plates move around, these interactions produce a lot of secondary effects that are really important for the history of the Earth. And the movement itself is driven by the heat flow of the Earth. This hot Earth is trying to cool itself. We end up with the plates moving around horizontally. This crust, in turn, particularly if two oceanic plates meet, the older, denser one goes down back into the mantle. The upper one rides on top, okay? And when this happens, this dirty, wet crust goes down and is heated up again in the mantle and starts to melt. And what's produced is a lighter, fluffier, crustal kind of rock. This material is rich in the element silica. It's actually a silica oxide, SiO2. And this material is so light and fluffy that it can't subduct. Too rich stuff stays on top. We'll just call that stuff granitic because, in fact, that's a major component of it. And over the history of the Earth, this light, fluffy scum can't go away. It tends to stick to itself. When two of them get together, they become a little bigger block of this stuff. And over the history of the Earth, this is how continents have developed. They're basically the light, fluffy stuff of remelted ocean crust that has nosedived into the mantle, been melted a second time, and lighter, fluffier stuff piles up. We know this because we can see it. This is an example of a very ancient block of crust in Australia, and the white stuff is granitic material. The green stuff in between it is trapped, kind of pinched in ocean crust. We call these granite greenstone belts, and they're great repositories of the history of the Earth. This continental growth, this curve is dashed because this is kind of fanciful. The numbers aren't very good, okay? It's very clear that these continents started to grow sometime about 4 billion years ago. It's also very clear by about 700, 800 million years ago, we had almost the entirety of the continents we have now. Somewhere around 2.5 billion years ago, which is a kind of a key moment, we probably had most of them, 75, 80%. One thing these continental blocks do is they create a subaerial environment, a place where it's not under an ocean, but actually under an atmosphere. And in that setting, we have waves crashing on it, we have rainfall, we have weathering. We have the original granitic rock being altered by interactions with the atmosphere and the hydrosphere, creating new minerals, creating little chunks of rock that are moved down by rivers and streams if you have precipitation. And again, we can see this record and try and read it, and we see that the early Earth was very different than the Earth we know today. And it gives us some interesting clues about the early atmosphere. One of the things we find in some of those sediments on these very old continental cores is minerals that are not stable in an oxygen environment. And I've listed a couple of them here. I'm not going to bother to read them. Another thing we note is that some of the features that we do associate with modern rocks, such as kind of red-colored sandstones and traces of soil within lithified sections of rock, those don't show up at all until about 1.7, 1.6 1.6 billion years ago. So clearly, we went from an atmosphere that had very little oxygen, and we turned it into one that's full of oxygen. One other thing I need to mention is that through all of this, we see the presence of liquid water. The very fact that these sediments exist requires some medium to move them around, almost certainly liquid water. Yet the early sun was very, very weak by comparison to what we have today, about 30% weaker, okay? Way, way too little solar radiation to just warm up and create liquid water. The best answer we have for that is that the early atmosphere was probably almost entirely CO2, and we had a massive greenhouse effect in the early epochs of the history of the planet. Hopefully you've all gotten some exposure to greenhouse effect, but let me give you the very short answer. The answer is this. The sun sends light to Earth and it reaches the surface because CO2 in most atmospheres are fairly transparent to visible light. But when the rocks warm up, they re-emit that energy in the form of infrared radiation, and CO2 is not transparent to infrared radiation. And as a result, the atmosphere itself heats up, it retains that heat, okay? And over time, you end up with an equilibrium where the only CO2 that can get rid of any heat is at the very top of the atmosphere. Everything below it is dramatically warmed.
Why didn't the moon have the same formation as the Earth, creating an atmosphere and everything, if it came out of one big planet?
That's a great question. And in fact, early theories of the moon suggested that the moon and the Earth should have just formed like a brother and sister kind of hanging out together and be identical in composition. That was one of the theories that was rampant right up till the days of Apollo, when we got to the moon and found that the moon rocks were dramatically different. They had completely lost every light volatile element that is, the elements that prefer to turn into gases, some of which you would never think of here on the Earth's surface as volatile materials, things like sodium and potassium metal. They're just gone. Okay? There's not a drop of water that they could find during their investigations of those early rocks. You're hard-pressed to find an Earth rock, even the most ardent new volcanic rock, that doesn't have a couple of % of water in it. The moon rocks had zero, zilch, nada. Okay? That and a whole bunch of other things that they saw pointed to a moon that was basically made of material that had condensed from a vapor, and in some very, very dramatic fashion, and had lost almost every element that could be lost if it became a gas and kind of floated away to space.
It might not be fair because you're young. My father was a petroleum geologist. And
Thank you for that, by the way.
And when my son first started studying plate tectonics, my father would tell these stories about the 1940s and 50s, people getting laughed off the stage at conferences for discussing plate tectonics. What was the resistance?
The problem was that, in fact, plate tectonics, under another name called continental drift, had actually been around since the 1500s. I mean, when they first started making maps of North and South America, they recognized that the eastern coast of South America matched really well with the western coast of Africa, okay? And a guy named Alfred Wegener at sort of the turn of the I was going to say the turn of the century, that would be 10 years ago. 110 years ago, Alfred Wegener started collating all the evidence that these had been connected together. And it was a great pile of evidence. It was every bit as good as the evidence Darwin put together to explain the origin of species and natural selection. The problem was, where Darwin went to great lengths to show what the mechanism behind it was, Wegener said, I've shown you that it happened, you figure out why. He didn't have a driving mechanism. And that drove scientists nuts. How can you put forward a theory and not put forward an explanation for the theory? And in the end, he started caving in, and his explanations were bad. He said, oh, the Earth must have been smaller, and it inflated like a balloon, which is totally ad hoc, okay? And that was the resistance. And it wasn't until actually in the 40s and 50s when we understood that the mantle was churning from internal heat, particularly that coming from radioactive isotopes, that we had a mechanism to drive plates around.
You refer to an intuitive picture. How much of this is theory? How much of this continues to change? And how does the computer help in mapping a lot of these and fixing some of these ideas?
The short answer is that I am skipping over hundreds of years worth of data to try and simplify this a little bit tonight. So forgive me for that. But I haven't told you any lies either, okay? Everything does have data behind it, okay? And computers have played a key role in a lot of this. Let's go back to an example of the origin of the moon. The main thing that convinced people that the moon came from a giant collision was that people started modeling these kind of processes and realized that there was a whole class of likely collisions that could occur that would result in some proportion of the material hanging around in the target system. And you could say that as many times as you want, but until someone showed a computer simulation and kind of turned it into a video, nobody believed it.
In the first part of his talk, Professor Harvey discussed the formation of the Earth and followed that through the emergence of continents and an early carbon dioxide-rich atmosphere. In the second part, he will describe how life changed that early Earth. Now let's return to the lecture.
Last week, Patricia Princehouse clued you in on ideas about the origin of life on Earth. So I'm not going to spend time on that. I'm just going to tell you that we see clear signs it was there. Okay? We also see clear signs that it had, by about the age of the continental pieces that we see, those sediments I was talking about at about 3.8, 3.7 billion years ago, by that time there were clear signs that the Earth had been colonized. It is almost impossible to find organic material that has been preserved from those time eras. However, when we do, they all show serious enhancements of the isotope of carbon-12, which is strongly favored in biological reactions, and there's no favoritism at all in inorganic or purely mineral-based reactions. So we see signs that liquid water was there in the presence of these sediments, and we see signs that something, and I'm not going to describe the organism because I wasn't there, something was heavily favoring carbon-12. And that something, as far as we can tell right now, almost certainly was organisms of some kind. That's not the key to my story, though. The key to my story is something that happens a little later on. I don't know how much later, but I think it happened. The record suggests it happened at about 3 billion years ago. In terms of planetary changing processes, this may be the big one. Photosynthesis came about. It evolved. Organisms had diversified to the point where one group of them or a bunch of groups of them had the genetic mechanisms available that this was a viable energy source. Okay? And this particular metabolic reaction is one that allowed them to colonize the single largest niche our planet has to offer, where we have water and organic material and everything. It's the surface and the shallow interior of the oceans, okay? When an organism finally learns to exploit that, it takes over, okay? Not only that, but it produces an extremely reactive waste product, oxygen. Oxygen is probably one of the most reactive chemicals that you're going to run into every day. It doesn't seem to bother us that much, but we've evolved to deal with it, okay? The truth is that oxygen is produced as a waste product. It immediately wants to react with something around it, and that, as an organism, is a great thing. You know, I got rid of my waste products, and it just went away. But it doesn't work for us. Doesn't work for the planet either on the large scale, particularly in the long terms of time, large geographical scales. And the result is photosynthetic organism pumping out this oxygen. And part of this photosynthetic process is to draw down the CO2 as well, okay? And before you know it, the organisms are starting to fill the oceans with dissolved oxygen, and they're drawing down the CO2. And during this period, the atmosphere is being reduced in volume. The CO2 is going into photosynthetic organisms. Some proportion of it's that's just dissolving in the oceans. Water's a good solute for gaseous CO2. But the organisms make that exponential. Not only that, they have the ability to use that CO2, they turn it into organs. They turn it into organic material that makes up their bodies, and when those bodies sink to the bottom, whatever they are, of the ocean, you've sequestered that CO2 away. It's not part of the cycle of atmosphere and hydrosphere anymore. So you've kind of, in a sense, removed it almost permanently, okay? And that, in turn, cools the planet. We see some other signs of the saturation of the oxygen in the oceans. One of the rocks that's passing around is I forgot to mention, the smaller white rock that's passing around is one of these stromatolitic organisms from about 1.7 billion years ago. It's the fossils of them. If you had a microscope, you could see all sorts of little nice blue-green algae in there, fossilized. Okay? Another rock that's passing around shows bands of kind of gold colors and bright red and metallic colors. This is a sample of banded iron formation. Starting at about the oldest rocks we have, kind of here, there, and otherwise, and moving on to like about 2.5 billion years, all the way into about 1.7 billion years ago, banded iron formations can be found in the rock record. And what these represent is places where iron that was dissolved in the oceans finds a free oxygen atom, they combine, and it turns out that iron oxides, unlike just plain old metallic iron, is not soluble in water. Okay? We're talking about rust here. Okay? We're talking about taking metals and getting it wet, and what happens is that the metal, just water on the metal is fine, but once it starts to be mixed with oxygen, it becomes a material that is a solid. It cannot be dissolved anymore, and it starts sinking to the bottom. And so through this period, we see first gently and then severely iron combining with oxygen in the ocean and forming these huge chemical sediments that are basically clearing the ocean of oxygen. But the photosynthetic organisms keep going until the oxygen has built up to the point where it's taken out all the iron that can be delivered, and it's starting to build up even more. There are other increases in oxygen in the oceans also provide yet another mechanism to dump out CO2, because a little bit of oxygen in the oceans with dissolved CO2 can make something called CO3, which is called a carbonate ion, and carbonate is another solid that once it forms kind of sinks, or it's a solid, it's not dissolved anymore, and it's another way to get CO2 out of the system. And organisms start to exploit this, and we'll see they exploit that in a very interesting way. So through this period, kind of 3.8 on to about 2.5 billion years ago, and continuing on into about 1.5 billion years ago, the oceans are building up oxygen and dumping out CO2. The atmosphere is effectively thinning, losing a huge amount of mass, and we're going from an atmosphere that is mostly CO2 with a little bit of nitrogen to having the CO2 a minor component, with nitrogen the major component. And that's going to have some serious effects. But before we get to that, one other thing is happening on a kind of a global scale. And this is really important, and this is one of those things that you don't often see in layperson descriptions of the history of the Earth. The Earth is losing water by the oceanful, by the seaful. Okay? And the reason for this is that if you have water vapor in your atmosphere and it circulates high enough up, it's going to get hit by UV from our sun, and our sun's getting brighter and brighter. When those the H2O, which is just an oxygen and two hydrogens, that's our water, is hit by UV light, a hydrogen-oxygen bond is typically broken. Doesn't happen to every single one, but it happens enough, and the oxygen quickly reacts with something. The hydrogen, being light and airy, flies off into space, and your water's gone for good. You can't call the hydrogen back. So over the history of planets, particularly if they are warm enough to have liquid water, and that means water vapor circulating as well, water loss is a given. It just goes away. And it goes away at a fairly tremendous rate. The catch is that it's not something we have a good measure of when it's happening. I will show you, however, we have a way to gauge its importance in history. At about 2.5 billion years ago, we reach a critical moment. And it's shown on this chart kind of where the red line, which is oxygen in the ocean, starts to skyrocket. This is the moment where suddenly the oceans are completely saturated with oxygen. Photosynthetic organisms have been pumping it out. It's been trying to react with everything. It's been forming carbonates and iron oxides and everything. It's done all of that. There's no more iron. There's no more, it's just the trickle coming in off the continents that it's reacting with. That excess oxygen starts to leak into the atmosphere, okay? And that is where the oxygen you're breathing today has its origins, and that's going to play a really critical role, because one of the things that happens when you have nice oxygen, and oxygen is an O2 molecule, two oxygens hanging out together. One of the things that happens if that's up there in the atmosphere with the UV light is that it too will break. But that oxygen is so reactive that if you have a free oxygen atom here and a free one there, they're going to grab the nearest O2 molecule and stick with that for a brief period of time. That material is O3. That's called ozone. You've all heard that, okay? Ozone is forming and unforming continuously. And every time it does that, it's soaking up that UV. And by soaking up that UV, it is preventing that UV from busting your water molecules. This is our savior, the ozone layer in the atmosphere. It is what stops water from being lost by the planet. Okay, so by this time, 2.5 billion years ago, oxygen is starting to build up in the atmosphere. CO2 is just diminishing rapidly and rapidly. CO2, of course, has been helping keep the planet warm. This nice blanket of CO2 is going away. The planet gets cooler and cooler and cooler. Perversely, CO2 goes into cold water better than it goes into warm water. Okay, that's why soda fizzes until you warm it up. Okay, or why it doesn't fizz until you warm it up, I'm sorry. In any case, what we have is a planet that is cooling rapidly. It's no longer losing its water. Combine cooler temperatures and lots of water, and you get an ice age. And not just any ice age. We see signs that in this period of about 600 million years ago, that the Earth literally froze all the way through, or as close as it could possibly get. This is bad news. This is an era that's often called snowball Earth. And the signs of it are glacial deposits that appear to be absolutely global. We can't find any rocks on the Earth in this time period that aren't ground to bits by glaciers or rocks that are dropped by glaciers. It's an incredible, strange period of time. Not only does the Earth start to freeze over, particularly the oceans, but the minute you've got that white coating on the globe, you've got a fairly reflective sphere. The solar energy that was warming your surface is being reflected right back out into space. It's a feedback mechanism that, frankly, from simple models is very, very hard to reverse. It seems that if you did not have some escape plan, photosynthesis leads to a frozen planet, okay? Now, obviously, that didn't happen. Obviously, this ice age was broken somehow. And the best answers we have right now is that this happened early enough in Earth's history that volcanic activity, spurred on by the Earth trying to lose its heat, released a lot of CO2, kept the temperatures high enough, okay, kind of breaking the cycle, okay? Also, photosynthesis just goes away if you coat the planet in ice. So CO2 typically is not being converted to O anymore. So any CO2 that's leaking out of the planet isn't being used up immediately. This is a hard boundary to cross, okay? And I can tell you that modelers around the planet are still trying to figure out the details of it. There are still people who deny this snowball Earth period really exists, but the rocks are there. There's no getting around it. This snowball Earth activity isn't over. Okay, we've seen ice ages that were pretty severe throughout the Earth's history, and in fact, we're kind of in one now. It was only 18,000 years ago that North America, from about here northward, was covered by 3,000 meters or more of ice, okay? It drew down the oceans 200 meters, okay? So there's a feedback here between CO2 and oxygen and temperature and albedo and everything, really not completely in equilibrium yet. Okay? We'll talk more about that in a little while. Critical moment number 2 is the end of this ice age. During this period, which may have been as long as 300 million of years, photosynthesis is shut down. And diversity amongst the organisms that survive and natural selection leads to selection for some critters that have a couple of special properties. One is they're not turning CO2 into oxygen. They've found a mechanism to do the opposite, to take the newly oxygen-saturated oceans and flip it around and combine that with the carbon of all of its dead plant-like friends, get energy out of it kind of in reverse. And not only that, it turns out to be more energetic than photosynthesis, okay? Number two, somewhere in there, some of those organisms also diversified to the point where they found ways to use the CO2 and the oxygen to build bodies out of carbonate and to build bodies out of silica, okay? That stuff isn't just coming out abiologically from the oceans, it's becoming a part of the cycle of metabolism. And the organisms that somehow, diversified to get these bits of natural selection mechanics in them are the ones that come out of the snowball Earth period to compete with photosynthesis, plants, in other words.
I'm confused about the banded iron, in that when you push iron underground in an anaerobic atmosphere, it tends to form FeO rather than Fe2O3.
Right.
It's the Fe2O3 that's red. Like
Yep.
if you look at volcanic rocks, they're FeO.
Yep.
They weather to Fe3O4,
Right.
and finally they weather to Fe2O3, hematite. But then why do we see the red in these very old rocks, through the thickness of the rock, instead of by weathering afterward?
I'm going to take the liberty of simplifying your answer a little bit, because clearly you know a lot about iron and oxygen. And one of the things you know and I know is that there are a whole zoo of compounds between Fe as a metal and Fe3O4 and everything in between. Iron and oxygen love each other. They can form a lot of different compounds, okay? It's Fe++, the ion, dissolved iron in the water, that is available very early in the Earth's history, because a lot of the rocks that are forming and weathering really aren't being exposed to atmospheric oxygen, and they get into the ocean as dissolved Fe2. Okay? However, the affinity of iron to oxygen is so severe that they first form FeO, which is one oxygen and one iron. They form FeO2, okay? Fe2O3, okay? And sometimes you have an Fe2O3 and an FeO together, which is Fe3O4. And every one, there's a whole zoo there, depending on the relative amount of oxygen, the relative activity of that iron. In fact, we still see that today. You can often go out and look in, if you're on a hike in the woods somewhere. A lot of the subsurface of northeast Ohio has coal and oil and gas and things, highly reducing substances that turn the cycle back, and some water gets Fe dissolved back in it. As it reaches the Earth's surface, combines with that atmospheric oxygen, you see these brilliant colored scums, red, yellow, orange, everything in between. Same process the Earth went through billions of years ago still happens today. The difference is back then it was global. There was very little free oxygen available. And these banded iron formations, to get back to your rock, they actually do have not just Fe2O3, but Fe3O4 as well. You can see magnetite, hematite, all the different kinds of iron oxides. There's sulfides and other things in there too. It's just a full-blown cornucopia of iron and oxygen compounds, almost all of which are not soluble.
The recent news that we once had 2 moons, is that fairly well accepted, and does it modify any of this?
That's only a variation on the theme. Basically, all they're saying is that, before there was a moon formed out of this debris, there was lots and lots of little ones that had to come together to make the big moon, okay? And all they're simply arguing is that maybe it wasn't this nice, smooth hierarchy. Maybe for a while we had 3 or 4 medium-sized ones, some came together to make a big moon, the other ones came apart, etc. The best way to really look at it is for a while, the Earth had a beautiful ring of moon material. And over time, that ring evolved to form a big body, and all the rest of the stuff kind of got disturbed out of the system or crashed onto the Earth or the moon.
We hope you've been enjoying the Origins Science Scholars Program with Professor Ralph Harvey. Professor Harvey is Principal Investigator of the National Science Foundation's Antarctic Search for Meteorites, a 35-year-old project to mount annual expeditions to Antarctica. We've heard about how photosynthetic plants converted carbon dioxide in the Earth's primitive atmosphere into free oxygen, and how the presence of that oxygen altered the course of the planet's history. In our final segment, we will learn how, ever since, Earth has seen a back-and-forth tug-of-war between oxygen-producing organisms, like plants, and oxygen-consuming ones, like animals. Now, back to Dr. Harvey.
So we've had this tipping point. The Earth's atmosphere has started to rise in oxygen, and suddenly we have organisms that like that oxygen a lot, and they're using it as the basis of their metabolism. We call those organisms animals. And from here on out, I'm just going to call photosynthetic organisms plants, even though that's doing them a disservice. And as the two co-evolve and diversify on the Earth, not only in terms of their own body plans and their own mechanisms, but as they colonize this Earth, we see wild swings in the balance of CO2 and oxygen. Now, forgive me for kind of a geeky graph. This is a graph where the upper grayer line is the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere with a baseline right here, this dashed line. This is the CO2 in the atmosphere, and so current oxygen levels are right there. Current CO2 levels are almost off the chart. They're very low. Okay? The point is that you see some fairly strong symmetry here. Okay? These are complementary curves. Oxygen goes up, CO2 goes down. Okay? And vice versa. Oxygen goes down, CO2 goes up. And what you're looking at here is the battle over the last 550 million years between plants and animals for control of the atmosphere. Okay? It's not a purposeful battle. It's just the war of natural selection. And I want to look at some of the places here, big deviations on this, marked by the green arrows, very briefly, just to give you a sense of the drama of this. Okay? This first little dip right here is the Ordovician period. And what we've got is animals diversifying in plan. They're learning to eat algae and corals and stuff. They're getting hard parts. They can crunch them up. Photosynthesis is at its lowest point, so to speak, and animals are dominant. So they're using up the oxygen, and this is the oxygen curve here. They're using up the oxygen and driving it downwards. Okay? A little bit later, the plants have an innovation. Aha! They go and start colonizing the, forgive me, Patricia, for anthropomorphizing evolution. I just want to dramatize this a little. Okay? The plants figure out how to colonize the continents. Okay? Now that's probably simply just some diversity within some organisms. It builds itself. It has the ability to build a shell that can handle being dried out a little bit. Okay? But there's no competition there, no predation there. Plants take over the continental surface, and as a result, oxygen just goes shooting up. But guess what? Our little critters, our little animals, are just a few steps behind. Pretty soon, you've got your fish with little legs like Tiktaalik here. They're going out, munching on the planets, and pretty soon, they're taking over, driving the level of, using up the oxygen, driving it back down. Right here, where at the start of the Carboniferous, we seem to have another dramatic change. Not only do we have a big die-off of some of these animals that I'm not sure I know the answer to, what I do know, though, is this is the moment that hard plants develop. Think trees. Bammo, little Tiktaalik here isn't going to eat a tree. He doesn't have teeth. It's not a beaver, okay? Suddenly, oxygen levels skyrocket to the highest levels that the history has recorded. There's so much oxygen in the atmosphere at this time, you can be the size of a Volkswagen Beetle. And I say that ironically because I'm talking about insects and beetles. And you don't even need lungs. You can absorb enough oxygen just through your skin to survive. Okay? This is that time with giant dragonflies and centipedes that scare you in movies. I'm not going to go over this part in detail. I'm simply going to say that this war continues to this day. And sometimes it's punctuated by severe changes in the arrangement of the continents that may seal off an important ocean near the equator and cause a lot of evaporation, or an ice age comes along again, messing the whole thing up. It's not done. Okay, we see swings throughout history of the levels of oxygen. Since about the last 100 million years, oxygen has steadily been increasing up to current levels. CO2 has been steadily dropping, suggesting things at some level have stabilized toward an environment friendly to animals, or friendlier to animals than to plants. Okay? But there are lots of minor squiggles. We need to talk about Venus and Mars, and I'm gonna skip a lot here. We'll start with Mars. Mars is smaller than the Earth, a lot smaller than you've been told. 10% of the mass of the Earth. That means a lot less gravity, okay? It has an atmosphere that's CO2, okay, but it's only about 1% that of the Earth. It's a cold place. It gets about half the sunshine of the Earth. It's just further out, okay? And it has no tectonics. It has what looks like kind of one big plate, maybe two if you want to call the north something different than the south. We see some volcanoes, sure. We see heat coming up and kind of blasting things around, but no horizontal movement of the plates. We see clear signs of water. It's never been a question to planetary geologists, does Mars have water? It's how much of it was liquid and for how long. And the answer is, there seems to have been a fair amount of liquid early on, but by about 3.5 billion years ago, it's gone. And we'll talk a lot more about that next week. The reason we do know why it's gone, it's that loss of water due to photodissociation, UV light coming in and breaking hydrogen-oxygen bonds. Here's the little tracer of that process. Some water molecules, instead of having two hydrogens, have a hydrogen and a deuterium, the heavier isotope of hydrogen. And that deuterium doesn't fly away into space at the same rate as normal hydrogen. When we look at Mars's rocks and Mars's atmosphere, we see it has about 5 times the relative abundance of deuterium that the Earth does, suggesting very strongly that Mars lost 5 times the amount of water that the Earth did. Both planets lost water, but over the sum of its history, Mars lost a lot more of it. Maybe so much that, in fact, it really hasn't been viable as a surface fluid for 3.5 billion years. Venus, same atmosphere, mostly CO2, a little smattering of nitrogen, no water to be found in it. This has, on the other end of the scale in terms of thickness of the atmosphere, 90 times as much atmosphere by mass as the Earth. Otherwise, it's a beautiful sister planet to the Earth. And in fact, up until the 60s, a lot of people were really hoping for something like this. They were hoping for oceans, and that shell of clouds that Venus showed was just steam from, tropical oceans. And I had to throw this in. This is Zsa Zsa Gabor as the Queen of Venus in Queen of Outer Space, and she's pretty steamy too. The CO2 that blankets Venus so thickly, so heavily, contributes almost, it leads to surface temperatures that are pushing 800 degrees Kelvin. Let's just call it 500 degrees Celsius, okay? Enormous high temperatures. No liquid water can survive that. The atmospheric structure is actually quite similar to the Earth. It's got a beautiful, what's called an adiabatic curve. Simply, it gets warmer as you get deeper into the atmosphere. But here's a very telling sign of the differences. On Earth, we see a bump toward higher temperatures right here. That bump, that's ozone. UV being absorbed by ozone kind of heats the ozone up. The Earth's atmosphere has a warm layer up there, which is our nice protective friend ozone, saving our water. Venus doesn't have it. And the amount of water that Venus has lost is 100 times that of Earth, according to these deuterium-hydrogen ratio measurements. Venus has no plate tectonics like Earth. Like Mars, it seems to have tectonics that are basically the crust bulging up and down, no slipping and sliding side to side at all. Okay? So why the differences? Well, some of them you probably have figured out. Loss of water is a key thing. okay? Without that liquid water, you've got no sink, no place to put that CO2. And it's not just about CO2 dissolving into the water. It's about weathering, moving bits and minerals into the oceans where they can react with the CO2 and form carbonates. Those sinks go away. The possibility of life seems to have gone away too. Water is a key element. It is the solution on which the organic chemistry of life is based, okay? Greenhouse warming clearly plays a role too. All of these planets, that's a Freudian slip. All of these planets had greenhouse that were severe to begin with. That's a given, okay? What's different about the Earth is that the Earth found a way to cool itself, okay? That's the presence of this liquid water, the survival of that water due to the formation of an ozone layer, okay? Another thing that you won't probably get in most layperson's articles is that this difference is so fundamental, the survival of this water due to the early formation of an ozone layer. That water, as it's subducted down into the crust, as oceanic crust subducts into the mantle, that water down in the mantle drops the melting point of the mantle, makes it behave much more plastically. The same way, for example, you might add a few drops of water to a stale piece of bread so it doesn't behave brittly anymore, it behaves more plastically. Same thing. Plate tectonics on the Earth is, in some sense, a result of the continued driving of water down into the mantle as oceanic plates subduct. Without that water, the movement of the plates grinds to a halt. And like Venus and Mars, Earth would just be moving up and down, not side to side. I do think the development of photosynthesis as a metabolic pathway for life is really the key. Because not only does it produce the oxygen that's going to create the ozone layer and stop water loss, it dramatically accelerates, almost exponentially, the ability of the planet to draw down CO2. And it sequesters it away, okay? Drop out your CO2 as a limestone at the base of the ocean, and you're going to have to subduct it, or you're going to have to heat it up to get that CO2 back out. And if you subduct it, it's gone for billions of years. It's no longer part of this cycle of plants fighting animals, etc. You've effectively cooled your planet. Obviously, it's possible to cool it too much, okay? That's something that we don't have a record of in our solar system. We don't see a planet where photosynthesis drove it to become an ice ball, but it's clearly very possible. Leads me to my final point. The Earth's atmosphere is hopelessly reactive, okay? We're stuck with an atmosphere that's bouncing between different disequilibriums, whether we like it or not. Photosynthesis has seen to that. There are lots of signs that it continues today. You're all of an age to remember the ozone hole, okay? It's not in the news anymore. But the ozone hole basically was an artifact of humans putting fluorocarbons into the atmosphere. They did the UV absorption thing, or they basically short-circuited the UV absorption thing, okay? And as a result, the ozone was used up. It went away, okay? It was only when humans decided not to release this stuff anyway, throw away your cans of spray, the ozone hole has started to heal, and it has started to heal, okay? It's amazing how sensitive our atmosphere is, okay, to very, very minor changes. A bigger change that's going on right now is the dramatic increase in the rate at which CO2 is going up. Now, clearly, I showed you times in Earth's history where CO2 was much higher than it is now, times where oxygen was much higher than it is now. The amount of CO2 is not the point here. The point is the rate of change that we have seen in the last 200 years is orders of magnitude faster than the rate of change in any period of Earth's history by natural processes. The rate of change is what scares geologists, environmental scientists, It's not the amount of CO2. That can go up or down. That just happens. It's the fact that it's changing so dramatically fast. If it continues to change at that rate, we can become Venus. Okay? We don't know how the planet's going to react. This is not meant to be a political diatribe. This is meant to enforce to you how out of equilibrium this atmosphere is, how different the Earth is. And it's all a result of photosynthesis. My last slide is actually a picture taken by the Terra satellite 2 days ago. According to the National Oceanographic Administration and Atmosphere Administration, we've set another record. This is the Arctic ice cap. And if you have good eyes, you can see that there's ocean all the way around it. Here's Asia, here's Greenland. It's only tied to the land one place right here. It is officially at, yet again, the smallest size it has ever been. We've set that record 4 times in the last 5 years. And once that ocean is open to the sky, you can see how dark it is. It gets sunlight, okay? It's being illuminated by the sun right now. It's warming. Warm water doesn't take CO2 in as well as cold water, okay? It's no longer reflecting away the sun the way it should. It's absorbing more energy. These kind of feedback mechanisms mean that CO2 issue that we were talking about can have big effects in a very short period of time. And with that, hopefully I've shown you that on various time scales, the atmosphere of the Earth, life on Earth, are very strongly linked, that the Earth is a very special place, okay? Very different from its sister planets, Mars and Venus.
This lecture is part of the Origins Science Scholars Program of the Institute for the Science of Origins, a partnership of Case Western Reserve University and the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. It has been brought to you with the generous support of Richard Morrison and the assistance of Case Western Reserve University's College of Arts and Sciences, Media Vision, and WVIZ PBS and 90.3 WCPN Idea Stream. For more information on the Origin Science Scholars Program, including a full video archive, please visit the Institute's website at www.case.edu/origins.